I make this not because I'm an authority, but because there's an unpleasant side to the field that's often just disregarded and not talked about. A sector or section of complacent and questionable practices. Now, I think that there are a multitude of reasons as to why these things are occurring. It is not just one isolated cause, and a starting point would be sharing perspectives and starting a discussion on them, looking at some of the relevant literature, and that is my intention and starting point for this series that is at least going to be 3 parts, maybe more. Now, it's tentatively titled as the struggles ... and I want to cover at least 3 angles. First, the struggles of people that are interventionists. They are the people that are working directly with folks, typically in settings of somebody that has some sort of intellectual disability. So in our field of behavior analysis, these interventionists are typically a registered behavior technician. However, I think a lot of these things I'm going to talk about today are not specific to that role, and that is not what I'm saying. It is an example of a type of role. I'd also like to look at the role of supervisors and the struggles that they are facing as well. And in our field, that is typically your board certified behavior analyst. Sometimes these folks also have their doctorate as well. Now, something that I'm a big fan of and what I want to do in the third video is look at the system as an entirety. And there's a lot of different factors to include here. There's the perspective of the different stakeholders involved, as well as the different governing agencies and the larger forces that are being placed through this emerging market that we're all living through right now. Now, for this video, I'm going to talk about the interventionist role. I'm going to structure this conversation through some common things that are experienced by folks in this role, as well as those of us that are working with people in these direct roles to some capacity. So the first thing that I want to talk about is direct care staff, interventionists, your registered behavior technicians, for example, in this case, being tasked with things that are above their skill set. When I entered the field in 2008, 2009, there was not a registered behavior technician role when it came to behavior analysts, but there were some state mandated trainings, and this is generally how things were across the landscape of the United States. But what it really came down to was the specific guidance and mentorship that you got from your coworkers and your supervisors, and it was really all about that culture, and finding the right culture, or stumbling really at the end of the day into the right culture, is where I specifically attribute a lot of my personal success and a lot of these thoughts as well, having the roots at least. These people had a huge role in everything, what you read, where you went to grad school, who you talked to, how you perceive different events. It was crucial. Now, I distinctly remember the first time that I was asked to help write a program that was going to teach an adult with an intellectual disability how to wash his hands. It took me forever to complete, and it was horribly designed on my own. Now, I had the guidance and the final check and approval through the mentorship and the guidance that I had at the site that I was working at, and it was fixed, but I had to personally struggle through and learn how to start applying the skills that I was learning in classes, and it was anything but easy. And without this work being put in by myself, there was no way for people to necessarily really shape my behavior. So it was a crucial step that I was meeting them halfway. And at first I didn't quite realize that people were trying to help me. This kind of Socratic method is what I was really often approached with when it came to the mentorship and guidance that I was getting. And it is frustrating, it's hard, but it is crucial in developing the critical thinking skills that are needed in the line of work that we often perform. And I didn't realize at first, but these people were helping me develop a skill set that was to critically look at and analyze situations throughout the totality of my life, not just in this 9-to-5 role. There's no point at which behavior analysis stops. It is not this 9-to-5 situation. Rather, it is a way to view the world around you. Now, it was much later when I understood all the different variables that are influencing the field, and as I learned some of those variables, things would become more and more clear that we needed people who could fulfill these roles and these sort of skill sets, and how hard it was to actually teach them. So I've linked an article below called Learning Science Design and Development Requirements by Dr. TV Joe Lang, and check it out. It is insane the amount of attention and care that goes into a well-designed system to be able to create a solid learning environment. So on one side, I have sympathy for people that are struggling through and trying to understand how to actually apply the things and getting these sort of requests from their supervisors. But on the other side, we ask that of our learners on a day-to-day basis, and we cannot forget that. And it really comes down to a well-designed system. And I think just as much as the RBTs need to be willing to step into these sort of situations, like in this example, The supervisors need to be designing systems that are extremely effective, because at the end of the day, if we're really truly going to save the world, we need to develop some of the sharpest critical thinking skills throughout everybody that is in our field. All right, so the next thing would be the training requirements and the systems just vary broadly in our field. Now, this is something that I'm going to get into and kind of the root and heart of video 3, talking about the systems and the different variables that are influencing there. And I think the heart of it is that we don't have really good established standards when it comes to behavioral health care. But throughout my interneting and my work and other things that I do, I run into many folks in this interventionist role that are saying that this 40-hour requirement for folks like a registered behavior technician is not enough. Now, know that it is relatively new. It's a step in the right direction. And now, in my opinion, it is not enough on its own. It is a part of the systemic solution. Now, this brings up just different stories about how people get into the field and get into this line of work. And my personal experience was I was told by a professor that, hey, if you want to actually learn how to apply this sort of stuff and help people's lives, which is what got me really, really excited and passionate about this field in the first place, is that you need to go in and talk to these different folks. So I emailed a bunch of different people, and one of the professors got back to me and said, yeah, we got some openings, here's how you get in. Now, I had 9 hours that I had available to be able to work towards the credits that I was going to be receiving in place of my work. Now, it was just me on the first day. I sat down, I was the only one in the cohort kind of being trained, and I waited for the trainer to come in. He came in, sat down, and he looked at me and said, hey, have you ever had a behavior analysis class? And I was like, yeah, I have actually. I took this class at the University of Nevada, Reno. And immediately closed the training PowerPoint and said, you don't need this, kind of tapped me on the arm and said, don't use those and don't get bit. What? Like, I'm responsible for people's lives and that's the training I get? Like, are you kidding me? Now, the crazy thing is that stories like this are just not untypical. Ask people that got into the field how they got into the field, and it is just amazing some of the stories that you've heard. And I think one of the issues is that stakeholders are often very far removed from these sort of systems and these sort of things. Now, you could look, so these stakeholders could be folks with the purse strings. Maybe it's insurance companies, maybe it's different state agencies and such. They aren't in there seeing these sort of things. Now, there's safeguards to be put in place, but there's oftentimes workarounds. These things can go about largely unnoticed. And I really doubt that most parents or guardians are realizing that these sort of things go on as well. I had no personal clue what to expect walking into this at all. Luckily, I was picked up by some coworkers in the area, and I had a good mentor that jumped on immediately and started helping me sort this stuff out and teach me things. But I didn't have those skill sets walking into the people that I was first being asked to help deliver services for, and that is just frightening at best. Now, the parent-guardian side, I'm drawing the line on personally. I cannot cover that. I would like to cover it, but I just cannot do that. I don't have children of my own. I'm not in a situation where I could do that sort of a video and angle justice. So I'm really asking for parents' support here in the comments below as proactively as possible, please. But I'm also interested in collaborating at some point on a video looking just at that angle and those sort of stories as well. So here's how to contact me if you're interested in doing that. And so if you walk into a system like this, the next question would be like, what are the other systems and other ways you can go about these things? And I've been piecing this together for the last like 8 or 10 years. And I want to next talk about the cost of an adequate or solid training program. There's a few different common solutions that I have seen that are out there, and one of which is typically the unpaid internship. I mentioned this is how I kind of came into the role myself. Now, I was working for credits when it came to the university system, but there are places that have strict, completely unpaid internships. And the thing here is that you need to be providing them some sort of value outside of the typical role and context that that job is being asked to perform. And this is largely taken advantage of. Now, these things can be designed to where you can actually be fulfilling these internship roles, or they can be designed to where you are doing the same thing that a paid employee would be doing. And at that point, it is shady and typically completely illegal. Now, that is one of the ways. The next way would be finding mentorship and guidance. And these are people that have typically been in situations where you experience the same things that you're going through. And they understand what it's like not knowing what the hell you're supposed to be doing. And they bring you in and say, hey, here's ways in which to understand this or obtain this sort of knowledge or gain this sort of skill set. And these folks are the real heroes in this story. They're the ones out of the goodness of their heart that are helping others in these situations. And there's a reason that I always will try to give back as much as I can in mentorship models, and it's because the people that got me into this field and helped me out the most are the ones that were doing that sort of stuff and helped me out in that sort of way. Now, however you're going about getting this better experience, you're always going to be juggling the various different aspects of life, whether it's school, work, life, mental health. your own personal health and well-being, that of your family, your loved ones, whatever. All of that has to be juggled on top of the sporadic schedule that we have in our field. Now, I am all for that you have to put in the work and actually understand and do as much as you can to develop your own personal skill sets. I mean, it's really what you put into it is what you get. But at the same time, we are doing very little to actually utilizing our science and the ways in which we teach and train and establish our programs. And it's saddening at the end of the day. So this brings up my next point. When we get into this field, almost everyone, I hope everyone completely, is into it because they want to make a difference in the world. They want some sort of good that they're trying to bring into the world. Now, just because you have a motivated employee does not mean that you have someone that has the skill sets to be able to do the tasks that are being carried out. And just in the last few weeks, the number of times I've been asked of how do you teach X, Y, and Z? My supervisor is asking me to do this sort of task. And I'm like, these are things that our field have been trying to sort out for 30 plus years. And if some of our greatest minds are trying to understand these things for that long and we're still not there yet, I question as to whether or not why we are even asking those things of people in those sort of roles. And I think part of the reason these sort of things are happening is this motivation, come in and do better and do as much as you can to try to make the world a better place, probably makes people default in this role of, yes, I will try to do that. But a yes doesn't mean that the skill sets are there. And it trickles down to a host of different problems as well here. The supervisors aren't getting what it is that they're expecting. The RBTs are struggling and are trying to stumble through this sort of stuff as well to meet the demands of employers. And then at the end of the day, the client outcomes are what are typically affected in these situations. And quite frankly, our field has very little research on the way that these practices actually affect these things at the very bottom. And now this brings up the interaction between the supervisor and the interventionists themselves. And these feedback loops are crucial when it comes to a well-designed system. One of the simplest things that I ran into recently was people asking what are the best practices for finding and getting a hold of your supervisor? And it's sometimes coming down to this telephone game sort of thing where you're trying to reach the person through other people or through different modes of communication. It gets really tricky to actually get your message across. And this telephone game seems to be the most practically effective thing in the moment, but we know it's not the most effective thing at the end of the day. And these sort of practices were something that I ran into in a facility in Florida. Specifically, when I showed up on the first day, there was a facility that had a few different homes and setups for whether it was group home services or if it was an educational sort of setting. And there was no other communication for help or backup if you were in a crisis situation, outside of opening the door and yelling that you needed some sort of help. Reminded me of the old practices of lighting the fire up on top of the hill and that sort of communication chain going and just how ineffective it was. So the first thing that I immediately did was set up a communication system to where we could effectively, quickly, and immediately communicate between those different facilities that were on campus so we could get the resources that we need when we actually needed them. So other common things that I hear that people are running into is supervisors have to just straight up beg for the supervision requirements, and I think that's partially because there's so much that's being asked of supervisors, as well as there is a lot that goes into a good system design. So I'm not pointing fault in that necessarily. We'll get into that stuff a lot more in the third video. But the point here is that a well-designed system should be really clear on when and how to reach a supervisor. At the end of the day, these sort of things bottleneck and clog the actual processes and the outcomes and learning of students. Now the next thing would be the inconsistency between feedback of supervisors. And I admittedly have been a part of this problem numerous times in my life. And one time specifically was we were setting up a facility for children with really severe behavioral needs, oftentimes in a 2 staff to 1 student situation. And very high profile cases, and a lot of attention and care was needed to be able to provide to those services to the fullest extent. Now what this did is it kind of created this too many cooks in the kitchen scenario, and there wasn't clear feedback lines of what feedback is delivered when, whom is to deliver that, and on what sort of schedule is that expected and going to happen, and how do we follow up with those sort of things. So at the end of the day, what I learned there is to completely streamline those sort of things and just analyze the hell out of them. Now this often brings in the question of which tools to use, email when, text when, Slack when, all those sort of things. And I have 2 quick thoughts here, and that is setting expectations based on the communication modality. So emails are replied to within X time versus text versus calls, etc. Allows you to make clear what is urgent when, essentially, and then automating as much of this as possible. Had the opportunity to work with a gentleman from Brazil that helped us set up a system to where when reports went in that were anything that had to do with the life, health, safety, and some sort of concern in those areas for a consumer. What we did is we had set up certain conditional things to happen, such as emails that would go out that would say, hey, this just happened and you probably want to know and act immediately. So technology can be our friend, and it takes a lot of time to put those things in, but is so worthwhile. Now the point here is that these feedback loops and inconsistencies or consistencies are known to be crucial when it comes to anything communication-wise globally. It's not central to our field, but we know better. The starting points that I suggest are analyzing when and who to actually be contacting, what modality it is that they're supposed to be using there, and then setting up some sort of really strict adherence policy and system to be able to follow through on those sort of things. And another thing is that these things can be automated and set up, and we need to be spending the time doing those sort of things. A good distinction is this technology of process versus tools. I'm going to link something here on that specifically. And lastly, I will gladly talk with anyone personally on this sort of topic. You can contact me below, check out the description. These are things that are hard to tackle, but I love working on these sort of things, and I'm glad to share information and ideas as to how we've tackled them in various different organizations in the past. The big thing to note there is it's not me solely. It's always required a team of people to work on these sort of issues. That brings us into the next topic, which is billable hours. Now, it is typical that only when we're directly working with consumers of our services is when we can bill for our time. And that makes a lot of sense at surface level, but there's some issues where it doesn't quite jive with our field. Specifically, that could be our data analysis procedures. Those are things that are crucial in helping people effectively reach their outcomes and desired goals. And it's also important in the instructional learning environment that we're actually designing, the program creation, the material creation, all those sort of things. And the rate is very important here. A good billable rate can help you offset those costs very, very easily. And I've worked in situations in which you have a very reasonably lucrative rate to be able to work on those sort of things, but it's not the standard. It is definitely not the standard. And I think it's often misunderstood just like how important this data analysis and some of these procedures are for us. Now, the approach of setting up a system where you can allocate time to work on these sort of non-billable things largely comes down to the system that is designed by the business owners, the creators of that place, whether it's directors, program managers, supervisors. It could be your folks in your BCBA roles, BCBA roles. It's typically interdisciplinary, and there's other folks involved there. And these are the folks it typically relies on, and there are exceptional programs out there, but I really do not think that the exceptional ones are the standard by any sort of means. And as a result, these non-billable tasks are perceived as overhead. And on the management side, they need to be looked at in that sort of way when it comes to accounting and such reasons, like you need to have that eye. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to the quality of our services, we cannot look at them in that sort of capacity. So a typical thing that's being experienced by these folks in this interventionist role that I've experienced myself or been in situations where I'm battling on how to not set people up in these sort of situations. Now, what's often happening in these interventionist roles is we are either cutting back those hours or we're expecting them to be completed, but completed off the clock. This is probably one reason we see salaries in our field and people are working 60 plus hours a week easy always. But another issue that just escalates this even more is that these things get force fit into billable time hours. What you run into is people saying, well, while he's on break, why don't you create those materials? Or, she's all right, just enter the data real quick, write that report real fast, and then get back to your programming. Or, yeah, why don't we do that supervision hour sort of stuff that you're needing and you've been begging me and asking for while you're working with your client? That's a perfect time to do it, right? And plain and simple, this stuff happens and it is not acceptable. I want to highlight that these things do vary from center to center, and there's, like I said, there's exceptional ones out there, but these are by far not the standard in our field whatsoever. And I think the solution again lies in a well-designed system and looking at all these different factors and influences that are going on, and then just putting in the work ourselves and using our science. And one last point here that's relevant is oftentimes supervisors are in situations where they're creating their own program because they didn't like what was happening before. Now we'll get into those sort of details specifically in the next video, but I think people underestimate the amount of work that it takes to be able to do the whole let's start up our own business and provide our own services. And as a result, there is a lot of time being stretched all over the place. And I've personally been in a position where you can design these programs to be able to allow for the non-billable hours. It is by no means easy whatsoever. And for us, it typically varied on the position that you were in the organization. Sometimes you had an hour or 2 or 3 per week. Sometimes you had 10 or 15 or 20 per week. And I think part of that stems in what I want to get into a video too, which is people are often not happy with the services that are being provided elsewhere, and they decide to start their own system without understanding any of the work that is required to creating their own company, business, and service model. All right, cancellations. This is the intersection of insurances and other funding streams with poor systems design. Now, no cancellation policy or a lack of an adequate system to actually handle these sort of situations often causes this ripple effect throughout the billing cycle. So what commonly happens is we get closer and closer to the billing cycle, there's more and more incentive to be able to make up as many of those sessions as possible. And although this helps safeguard against things that are very important when it comes to family time, sicknesses, and other things that are competing going on in the consumer's life, it also causes some problems on our end and influences other behavior. And so a metric like this of looking at the total hours billed and that are available for billing is a common metric that's looked at when we're looking at businesses that are providing these sort of services. But oftentimes what happens is it's used to schedule in these makeup sessions that aren't in the best interest of the client and are really there just to help keep the doors open at the end of the day. And I believe at the end of the day this is a topical solution as opposed to a systemic solution. If you want to learn more about what that is, I've linked an article down below as well. Now, if you have a cancellation policy, I'm asking that you share that below as well, because I'm not in a position currently to be able to share one myself. And if you have any data to go along with that or any stories, please do me a favor and take the time to write those out below for everybody here. Now, one typical strategy that's often deployed in organizations that is central to this issue at the end of the day of trying to meet the needs of the consumers on the time that they have available is to teach these interventionists how to walk in and deliver a program in the place of other staff and still maintain your integrity. My first thought is you can't rely on this for everything. This should be the exception and not the rule. And it requires a lot of cross-training and oversight and proactive management to be able to effectively pull this sort of thing off. People don't realize the totality of the system here and how well designed your materials have to be able to actually effectively pull this off. Now, I have seen extremely well-designed systems that take a ton of care and oversight to effectively pull off. But I've also seen well-designed systems that are built off of just outdated knowledge or practices when it comes to the effective practices that our field should be employing. And the point here is that generalization when it comes to our interventionists should be programmed for, not expected. We have to design those systems and those materials to be able to allow this sort of thing to happen and still hit our client outcomes. All right, the next thing I think that really impacts our interventionists is our field's disagreement and our leaders' disagreement on what it is that actually constitutes database decision making, how to actually do that, and our quote best practices in our field. All right, so the first one that I'll tackle is the disagreements on the principles of behavior. This is a very interesting thing that's caught my eye at a few different times, and this is just a quick sample of a group on Facebook in which I asked people, what are the principles of behavior? And you'll see here that there is zero correlation. Nobody is completely agreeing on what these sort of things are, but we rely and we use them as the reasons for what it is that we're doing and how we carry out our actual practices and methods. And now you might be like, okay, that is a student's page and it's social media, and kind of give me like the eye roll, right? Well, if we look at some of our top leaders in the field, they are still hashing this stuff out. But if we go into our research and we go into the discussion forums with the top leaders in our field, there is still complete disagreement as to what these are, to the degree to which they actually matter, even though we rely on them and use them all the time in our language. And we're seeing more formal research lines being established around the degree to which this actually matters. My point here is if we can't agree on what it is that we are saying is the foundation of our science, we're probably having a hell of a hard time teaching these sort of things to these interventionists and having a common shared language that people can really understand. All right, so number 2 in this section is database decision-making strategies, and at the end of the day, there's a few different strategies that are employed, but nobody actually agrees on what the standards are for database decision-making. And there's plenty of documentation that how we construct and look at these sort of things can actually mislead and misinform the decisions that we're making in practice. And it's something that we should be putting a lot more time and attention towards because it's affecting our clients. Now, when it comes to our best practices, Embry and Biglin in this article here laid out what I think are some of the pinnacle things that we should be utilizing and looking at when we're talking about designing effective behavioral programming for any setting. But these sort of things, even though our research is being synthesized and distilled and we're finding these consistent things like this are not in our training programs. This is an extremely valuable article. It's linked below. Check it out. It is I would love to nerd out with anybody on that topic. Now, articles like that not only aren't being utilized in our training programs, but we're also blatantly ignoring effective behavioral strategies and things that have been demonstrated in our research. A good example is head sprout, that can affect on a much larger scale at the same integrity level. And I question why it is that we don't even use those sort of things or try to pursue creating those things at the end of the day. And one other relevant thing here that's worth mentioning, since we're talking about these sort of lost things, is J.R. Cantor's Logician of Science. And so Cantor showed us that various different people can be looking at things in the same field but come to very different conclusions. And part of the reason there is they're coming in with different assumptions, different conceptual models. And so here's a few of the different models that I'm aware of myself. And when I'm talking about the different foundations that we have that we come in with, that's all the different behaviorisms. Here's a list of examples as well. Now, what he proposed is behavioral science is well positioned to be able to help synthesize this, not only for our own field, but for all scientists, since they engage in this sort of scientific behavior as well, and we could really help aid effective dissemination. Now, this logician's role would be to organize and synthesize information, whether it was theoretical or empirical in nature. And they would take this work from all these different fields in this sort of really meta grand way. They'd organize it, synthesize it, and be able to say, this is what we can say based on everything that's going on that is out there. And this fascinates me. This is something that we should be spending time in creating systems to be able to work on these sort of things. And this I bring back up in the third video. It is something that I'm actively trying to merge with another concept that I'll talk about then. All right, so that brings up our second to last major section, which is supervisors aren't adequately trained on how to appropriately supervise their interventionists. So when I hear this, a few thoughts come to mind. The first one is, yeah, okay, so like, what are we going to do? This field isn't in the place to actually be pointing the finger and saying, like, you need to be doing better. At the end of the day, we are a product of our learning history and our current environment and such. So we can't really do that. And then we also ask, like, who should be responsible for teaching and shaping this? There's large disagreement as to whether or not these are things that we should be training in our graduate training programs ourselves, or if these should be obtained through other avenues outside of our own training programs. Now, oftentimes what we hear is you should be doing this. And when I hear should, that the first thing we should all do is stop and say, what is it that they are doing? What is it that they are not doing, and why is it that they are doing those things in the moment and not doing these other things? This is a situation in which we can actually apply our science as opposed to saying, you should be doing this, right? We can analyze, understand, and then help influence that sort of situation. And as that's walked out, we find these other different influential variables and things and stuff that I'm going to be talking about in video 2 and 3 on this that actually affect this. Now, one kind of conclusion I've arrived to is I don't think we necessarily agree on what effective supervision looks like. There are some pioneers that I'm going to list down below, these two folks, and the colleagues and the teams that they're working with that are at least folks that I've talked to recently. They're trying to really work on demonstrating these sort of things and pioneering those sort of research lines. And I think the starting place is to get caught up on those conversations. Not to mention these people are doing some really cool work. Like, we can't do it all, and so we should all be working together and supporting each other in these roles. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is that this supervision structure, as it is now, especially if you're new in the last 1 to 3 years, is very, very new in our field, and it's actually generally perceived as a very good step. And I would wholeheartely agree with that. And I'd say we're progressing in a good direction relatively quickly. One of my favorite things to do at the various different conferences. So let's say you go to the Association Behavior Analysis International's annual event. There's 5,000 people, whatever it is that shows up there, and you'll find the folks that are wearing their badge, and their badge says something like 30-year member, 35-year member, 40-year member. Those are the folks that have the most interesting stories about the field. These people have all of the history, and while things right now aren't perfect, and my point of this whole thing is we should be doing more, and complacency is not a place that is okay. These folks have the stories that help gain a lot of perspective and insight, just how far we've actually come. And I don't know where else to get these other than going to those sort of things and talking with those people. We've made some significant strides. And the point here is I think we all owe it to ourselves, given we are historical science, to go out there and learn as much of the history as we possibly can. It provides a lot of context, it sets up the groundwork for empathy, and at the end of the day, we can all start working together and moving towards the collective future that we all see and that vision that we all share. And I'd like to stop it there and ask you, the interventionist, or you, the supervisor out there, what are the things that you want to see supervisors doing more of, or less of, interventionists doing more of or less of. And for both parties, what are the obstacles and hurdles that you're trying to overcome currently? I will do a short little plug on a podcast episode that's coming out sometime in May, probably with Dr. Tyra Sellers, that we completed to just kind of talk about supervision as a whole in a very plain English way. Very little jargon. And my last point to drive home is that these exceptional programs are the minority. It takes a really well thought out system with all these different variables taken into account and the commitment to continually refine and iterate and move forward. Alright, so this thing got really long really quick, so I'm going to stop it there. I will say that these things are very hard to articulate. I hope that I did it in a way that showed some passion but didn't overstep in any way. If I did, please make sure to comment below, and I can take the brutal feedback. Hit me with it. I really hope I didn't overstep. And again, my point here is not to be an authority, but to share my perspective and create a place where we can start talking about these issues. Bring in all the different people that want to actively talk about these and try to move things forward. And at the end of the day, my perspective, remember, is just a bunch of other perspectives. I mean, I am a product of my environment and my interactions and all that as well. So none of these thoughts are originally mine. Per se whatsoever. The big take home here is that all so often when I'm on the internet and running around going to conferences and talking with people, is there's a sense of complacency and that we are doing good enough. And that's within our field and across the nation. Like, it doesn't really have any sort of boundaries. And that is something that I totally and wholeheartedly disagree with. Completely. That is not the science that I signed up for. It's time that we start pushing ourselves a little bit harder. That's your Daily B.